Blues I'm Playing by Langston Hughes. Osceola Jones, pianist, studied under Philippe in Paris. Mrs. Dora Ellsworth paid her bills. The bills included a little apartment on the left bank and a grand piano. Twice a year, Mrs. Ellsworth came over from New York and spent part of her time with Osceola in her little apartment. The rest of her time abroad she usually spent at Biarritz or Juan Lepin's, where she would see the new canvases of Antonio Bas, a young Spanish painter who also enjoyed the patronage of Miss Ellsworth's. Bas and Osceola, the woman thought, both had genius, and whether they had genius or not, she loved them and took good care of them. Poor dear lady, she had no children of her own. Her husband was dead, and she had no interest in life now save art and the young people who created art. She was very rich, and it gave her pleasure to share her richness with beauty, except that she was sometimes confused as to where beauty lay, in the youngsters or in what they made, in the creators or the creation. Mrs. Ellsworth had been known to help charming young people who wrote terrible poems, blue-eyed young men who painted awful pictures, and she once turned down a garlic-smelling soprano-singing girl who a few years later had all the critics in New York at her feet. The girl was so sallow, and she really needed a bath, or at least a mouthwash. On the day when Mrs. Ellsworth went to hear her sing at an East Side settlement house, Mrs. Ellsworth had sent a small check and let it go at that, since, however, living to regret bitterly her lack of musical acumen in the face of garlic. About Osceola, though, there had been no doubt. The Negro girl had been highly recommended to her by Ormond Hunter, the music critic, who often went to Harlem to hear the church concerts there, and had thus listened twice to Osceola's playing. A most amazing tone, he had told Mrs. Ellsworth, knowing her interest in the young and unusual. A flair for the piano such as I have seldom encountered. All she needs is training, finish, polish, a repertoire. Where is she? Asked Mrs. Ellsworth at once. I will hear her play. By the hardest, Osceola was found. By the hardest, an appointment was made for her to come to East 63rd Street and play for Mrs. Ellsworth. Osceola had said she was busy every day. It seemed that she had pupils, rehearsed a church choir, and played almost nightly for colored house parties or dances. She made quite a good deal of money. She wasn't tremendously interested, it seemed, in going way downtown to play for some elderly lady she had never heard of, even if the request did come from the white critic, Ormond Hunter, via the pastor of the church whose choir she rehearsed and to which Mr. Hunter's maid belonged. It was finally arranged, however, and one afternoon, promptly on time, black Miss Osceola Jones rang the doorbell of white Miss Dora Ellsworth's gray stone house just off Madison. A butler who actually wore brass buttons opened the door, and she was shown upstairs to the music room. The butler had been warned of her coming. Ormond Hunter was already there, and they shook hands. In a moment, Mrs. Ellsworth came in, a tall, stately, gray-haired lady in black with a scarf that sort of floated behind her. She was tremendously intrigued at meeting Osceola, never having had before amongst all her artists a black one, and she was greatly impressed that Ormond Hunter should have recommended the girl. She began right away treating her as a protege. That is, she began asking her a great many questions she would not dare anyone ask at first meeting, except a protege. She asked how old she was, and where her mother and father were, and how she made her living, and whose music she liked best to play, and was she married, and would she take 1 lump or 2 in her tea with lemon or cream. After tea, Osceola played. She played the Rachmaninoff Prelude in C-sharp minor. She played from Liszt Etudes. She played the St. Louis Blues. She played Ravel's Pavane pour un enfant défunte. And then she said she had to go. She was playing that night for a dance in Brooklyn for the benefit of the Urban League. Mrs. Ellsworth and Ormond Hunter breathed. How lovely, Mrs. Ellsworth said. I am quite overcome, my dear. You play so beautifully, she went on further to say. You must let me help you. Who is your teacher? I have none now, Osceola replied. I teach pupils myself. Don't have time any more to study, nor money either. But you must have time, said Mrs. Ellsworth, and money too. Come back and see me on Tuesday. We will arrange it, my dear. And when the girl had gone, she turned to Ormond Hunter for advice on piano teachers to instruct those who already had genius and need only to be developed. And that's the end of part 1.